I've seen some social media angst over, against the journalists who've reported these stories, saying, why did you choose to report such a story? The central point of this letter, I think, has come down to the quote where they said, not trained to be commanders.
Yep.
Not trained to be commanders, desire to prove oneself in a predominantly male field, perceived gender bias, and ensuring a mean facade. For me, this is the highlight of this letter, where they're saying they're not trained, haven't received the kind of training to be commanding officers. This sounds a bit like a teacher complaining about her students. I come from a generation of journalists who've been on board Navy warships where there were no women's toilets. I've been on board with women journalists and there were no separate women's toilets. General Bipin Rawat, when he was alive, had famously said, there will be a time when women will be in the infantry. There will be a time when women will be in the armored corps. There will be a time when they will be in the mechanized infantry, whatever it is. He said, and I remember his words, he said, that train has left the station. The next big step in terms of women in combat is going to come from the Supreme Court. It'll come from the Ministry of Defense.
Hello and welcome. This is the 48th episode of Inner Defense, and Shiv, it's quite funny. It's actually the people in the Defense Ministry or the DRDO seem to be following along with our podcast, because just last week we had a nice discussion on India's missiles, and just this morning of this recording, we have had the launch of from a submarine of a ballistic capable nuclear missile. K4, I think, was a test launch. I don't think if it has been confirmed, because I think the earlier information was based on sources and not really any official statement yet. But I'm guessing there perhaps might not be a statement on this, because like you've said during the missile episode, that when it comes to the nuclear missiles, they tend to keep mum. But good to know that Inner Defense is kind of on track in terms of all the developments in the world of India's defense.
I really wanted to, we told you first, because, when that, notice to airmen had been put out, it was already in the air that this was going to be the K4 test. It's it's one of those darling missiles that everyone talks about, nobody knows very much about apart from its range. It's been tested a few times, but there's one sort of very pixelated video of one of the initial launches, and this launch apparently happened from a nuclear submarine, the INS Arikat, the new one. We've done an episode on that as well. So I'm like a kid in a toy store. I just can't wait to know more about the test and maybe see some pictures. I don't really care about a press release. It's understandable that the government doesn't announce these things, but this is the big mama of the nuclear triad. And I certainly hope that in the interests of sending out a big message to the world, the government puts out a video. Hopefully
definitely.
That'll happen.
I get your point about pictures, because when we were trying to do the copy on it and trying to find some rep images, we couldn't find anything. There's nothing to go with it. Anyway, we'll have those links in the description to kind of give context to this test launch. This week, what we'll talk about is a very raging debate that's happening on social media and elsewhere on the topic of women in military in general and Indian military in specific. The reason it's happening is because of a letter that has been written by a top Indian Army officer, Lieutenant General Rajiv Puri, who was the commander of the 17 Mountain Strike Corps when he wrote this letter. He's, I think, since then been sent back to the army headquarters. Not sent back as in punishment, sent back as in point of normal posting. The letter was to his boss, then the Eastern Army commander. The letter, if I'm not wrong, was dated October 1, 2024. Last month. And it generally is sort of a review of around, I think, 7 to 8 women commanding officers who served under him in his posting. And he was sort of giving his boss feedback on what he thought of their performance, overall performance, etc., etc. Just some highlights from the letter. And we'll come back to the highlights on the second point of the show, because I want to go to a very raging question in my head first. But even then, so that our listeners and viewers have some context, some highlights from the letter. So he has highlighted issues with these women commanding officers that range from but are not limited to interpersonal challenges, frequent complaints, centralized leadership style, entitlement and ego issues, a lack of empathy, overcompensation in leadership, celebration of minor achievements. Now, it's one thing for me to read it, and it's quite another for you to read it with some context that you would have with the benefit of the years of covering Indian Army and Indian military that you have done. But like I said, I'll just park that for one quick moment. The first question I want to actually talk to you about, the first point I want to talk to you about actually is why and how did this letter become public?
Yeah.
Because I think in my head that is a very, I mean, let me be clear, this has not been made public by the army in official capacity, but obviously somebody in the chain somewhere chose to leak it to journalists.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why? Because that has led to, I think, a completely unnecessary debate.
Yeah.
You now have people on one side saying, "See, we told you this is the old boys' club of the Indian Army, doing everything they can in their power to kind of keep the women away from higher postings." On the other hand, you have this, "Oh, see, we told you so. Women are not fit to serve in the army. Women are not fit to serve at senior leaderships," and that is not the debate we should be having in the first place. The debate is something else altogether, which what we'll get into in this debate in this episode, over the course of this episode. But why get this letter out in public? If it's a review, keep it amongst yourself.
Yeah.
His boss can take it up with his boss. They can have their group discussions. They can have their file notings, etc. Send it to the civilian bureaucracy for review and etc. And do the normal course of things. Why give it out to the media?
We think very much alike on this, Dev. I'm appalled that this has come out because you're right. This is something of a extremely sensitive nature, something that affects command, and the commanding officers, the quality of commanding officers, the command structure at the commanding officer level is what all armies pretty much base their entire stability and structure on. If you don't have good commanding officers, or you don't have a strong command structure, the army is pretty weak. Now, we all know that this is not true of the Indian Army. The Indian Army is a highly professional, strong, stable army that has done very many amazing things. But the fact that a letter of such a sensitive nature, a letter, mind you, that was written by the 17 Corps Commander, Lieutenant General Rajiv Puri, to his boss, who is the Eastern Army Commander, and copied to only two other people, the Adjutant General of the army and the military secretary. The military secretary, who sits in the army headquarters, think of him as the HR head of the army. He's in charge of postings and appointments and that sort of thing. Now, how did this letter get out? I don't want to speculate on that. There are any number of ways it could have gotten out. It's a futile exercise. It's a futile exercise figuring out how it got out. B, it's even more silly, and I've seen some social media angst over, against the journalists who've reported these stories, saying, why did you choose to report such a story? Now, why shoot the messenger on such a story?
Yeah.
If I had gotten my hands on such a letter, let there be no doubt in anybody's mind, I would have reported it. I would have reported it because, in the kind of slightly undelicate way to put it, it's a very juicy story.
Yes.
It's a very sexy story. It's it has all the elements of a great degree of drama that's taking place in the armed forces on a sensitive issue like women commanding officers. So why wouldn't anyone tell this story? And people have the right to know if something this sensitive, is ringing alarm bells at the highest levels. A lieutenant general, for God's sake, writing a letter like this. But I echo your views completely. I think the fact that it came out means that obviously someone in the army had an interest in this coming out. Someone wanted this letter to be much more than just an official letter confined to the chain of command and the internal bureaucracies of the army. They had an interest in this becoming a kind of a public talking point, because whenever someone leaks a letter like that, the intention is to basically amplify pressure on that issue, bring the spotlight on it, and maybe force some kind of decision.
Yes.
Now, if we look at this letter, and we'll go into the details of the letter in a bit, and it's an alarming letter. It's an alarming letter for various reasons, and I will tell you why. But just a cautionary note as we get into this very sticky territory is that this is a hugely complicated and layered area. Okay, and in areas like this, especially when it comes to women in the armed forces, it's always tempting to have very strong views and very fierce likes and dislikes. But this is the army we're talking about. this is a difficult business.
Yes.
It's a difficult and it is fraught with contradictions and problems and implementation issues that we will get into. But I think the fact that someone has leaked a letter of this kind is a terrible thing. It's terrible that a letter like this has leaked out, because it's not even a general letter, Dave. It's a letter about 7 or 8 commanding officers, presumably in the Eastern Command. Everybody probably knows who the general is talking about now.
Yep.
This will be the talk of the town in families. It will be the talk of the town in mess halls. It probably is the biggest story of the week or the month, maybe even the year, as far as the army is concerned. So I'm a little sad that it had to come out like this. As a person who admires the army and wishes it can solve its problems of this kind internally, but the journalist in me is not surprised at all. I think it's a good thing this has come out.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, you're right. Think of any officer in the Eastern Command right now, male or female. Think of what they must be thinking right now in terms of, what is happening with our unit, with our setup. Right. So let's get into the letter. Like I said, it's one thing for me to read about it. It's one thing for me to highlight those top pointers. But I have zero context. I don't know under what directive, under what or with what intentions the general carried out the study of his. I don't know with what intentions he's even written the letter, because there have been some who've been arguing that, hey, by the way, he's not saying that they're bad. He's just highlighting some issues that he thinks should be addressed by the army leadership so that the future women commanding officers do not, end up in such situations. All of this is speculation, right? There is another set that he says, hey, but the sample size was too small. This is just 7 or 8 women commanding officers under him that he's talking about, whereas the army has many more, dozens more. So you, knowing the army, you with your 20 years of covering the Indian military, Indian army, and with you being able to immediately give some sort of context to what has been written in the letter, take us through what's in the letter, your thoughts about it, and what is this all about? What is happening right now, Shiv?
So, to very quickly summarize what the letter says, the letter it's not a very long letter. It's a pretty brief letter that General Puri has written to his immediate superiors. And he, I don't want to overcomplicate it because there's a lot of jargon in the letter. But for the purposes of this podcast and for our viewers and listeners, let's just summarize the problems that are red flagged by General Puri in this letter about women commanding officers. Now, not many would know, Dev, that women commanding officers is not something that has been going on for a very long time. In fact, it just started last year.
Yes.
2023 is when the army had actually conducted a special selection board which promoted 108 women to the rank of to the rank of a select grade colonel, which allowed them to become commanding officers. When you're a colonel, that's the rank at which you can become a commanding officer. And so 108 women in the army are currently select grade colonels who function as commanding officers of units. You're right. There is we have no information on what kind of study was conducted, but I imagine that since women started, assuming command of units last year, there may have been some kind of a study that was undertaken to keep a tab on, where things are at as far as women are concerned. Because no matter how progressive we would like to think about the army is ultimately a very, very big, lumbering, traditional organization where change happens slowly.
Yep.
Nothing happens overnight. And some of these changes have happened quite rapidly. Some of them have happened slowly. The fight for women in the military dates back to 1950.
Yes.
To the dawn of independence. We'll get to that as well. That is a sad commentary on how long it has taken for the military to open up. But speaking specifically of the commanding officers under study here, the general in his letter has basically said that there are officer management issues. He's talked about how there is a lack of tact and understanding of personal requirements of unit personnel, especially officers, an uncontrollable urge to make derogatory statements regarding junior officers, to usurp credit rather than attributing it to subordinates and encouraging is routine. A few COs, women COs, have taken a low profile and low initiative to command. I'm quoting Rahul Singh's front page article in the Hindustan Times. lack of empathy may be attributable. He says there's a lack of empathy in many of these women CEOs. And he says the lack of empathy may be attributable to a need to overcompensate since they perceive that any sign of compassion may be indicative of a gender trait of being soft. The old trope of, oh, it's a woman, must be soft, can easily be manipulated. So therefore, women commanding officers are seen to overcompensate and be extra tough, harsh, or in some cases, as this letter seems to suggest, even cruel. In order to kind of establish power and authority. Predisposition to lean on the hierarchy as soon as an adverse situation develops. This is something else that the general talks about in his letter, which he says that any little problem that happens in the unit is escalated beyond up the chain of command instead of sorting it out at her level. Ironically, the next complaint is that centralizing decision making and lack of consultative approach. Taking decisions yourself without consulting your superiors. I found this very funny in the letter. In one paragraph, you're saying they constantly escalate everything. Any problem that comes up, they're escalating. Second paragraph, they're saying they don't take a consultative approach. They take all the decisions themselves. So I'm a little confused about that. The most damning, the central point of this letter, I think, has come down to the quote where they said, not trained to be commanders.
Yep.
Not trained to be commanders, desire to prove oneself in a predominantly male field, perceived gender bias, and ensuring a mean facade. For me, this is the highlight of this letter, where they're saying they're not trained, haven't received the kind of training to be commanding officers, which strikes me as a little odd. And we'll get into the good and the bad in this letter. There's very little good in my view. But the fact that, and I was having a conversation with someone, and I mean this with a great deal of respect because, I love the army and I love what it stands for. But someone I was speaking to said, this sounds a bit like, a teacher complaining about her students. A teacher basically saying, my students are just too restless and they are simply not disciplined. If your commanding officers are not well trained, I'm genuinely wondering, and I'm not even saying this in a kind of loaded rhetorical way, whose job is it to train them?
Exactly.
It may not be General Puri's personal job, but I'm just wondering that if you're identifying lack of training as one of the issues of some of these commanding officers, and you have found it such a big issue that you've put it down on paper and taken it all the way up the command chain to army headquarters, does it not reflect a failure on your part as well?
Exactly.
Doesn't it? Because the rest of the letter is a whole lot of we shouldn't mistake gender equality for gender neutrality, and there's a whole lot of other advocacy going on saying that there needs to be a policy for gender neutrality, etc. And some of this actually makes a lot of sense because and we'll get into that as well. There is a fear somehow that this obsession with gender equality has sort of skewed the priorities of the way things are done in the army. And this is a pushback from the patriarchal setup within the army, which believes that, look, you can't be doing this for tokenism or for symbolism or to show that, oh, chalo, we've got some women in the army. It has to be based on who's the best person for the job. Absolutely open up all the doors, create that level playing field for everyone, and then judge everyone equally. Even now, for instance, fitness requirements, test requirements are different for men and women because there are certain things that, as far as test requirements are concerned, where those gaps need to be maintained in order to bring women into the armed forces. If you don't do it, there'll only be men. It's as simple as that. And therefore, I think it goes down to the root of an army that has traditionally been resistant to women, in uniform. The amazing thing, Dave, is, and then we'll go to your next question. The amazing thing is, despite all of these sociological issues, despite many of the things that have been highlighted in this letter, this government and the earlier government have been clear that women will be in the armed forces. Yes. They will be in the military. And, the wrinkles and the hurdles will be ironed out progressively. There will be teething troubles no matter where you go. But ultimately, the goal is to have a level playing field where the door is open to both men and women. Anyone can apply.
Yeah. Right. We'll kind of just circle back to the problems in the army and in a bit, because I want you to give us some historical perspective, historical background on the resistance in the first place. And the reason I say we'll circle back in a bit is also the fact that we keep saying army a lot in the first half of this episode, which will begs the question, then have the Navy and Air Force done better? The answer to which is kind of yes. And I also want to understand from you why that has happened. But yeah, like I said, before we do that, some historical perspective. Why this resistance in the first place? Is it a very cultural thing? Because, if you look at the US, the UK, for example, the Western countries, they have been progressive in a way that they have driven the change in terms of integrating women in the armed forces at the policy level. In India's context, what has happened is it's been the judiciary that's been kind of leading the way and kind of forcing the military's arm.
Correct.
Because, I remember all those years growing up and then the initial few years of my career, remember reading headlines very often from the Supreme Court, from the High Court, castigating the military, the Defense Ministry for, giving weird reasons, calling them patriarchal and saying that, we've already passed orders and you're not implementing them. Finally, it was a Supreme Court order that led to women officers who were serving under the Short Service Commission
getting permanent commission
in 2020, if I'm not wrong. It was a Supreme Court order that led to NDA being opened up for girls. I think it was in 2021, just a year after that order, when the Defense Ministry or the military had said कि अरे भाई हम करेंगे but थोड़ा शांति रखो. The court was like नहीं शांति नहीं, इसी साल होगा, इसी exam में होगा. So you've had the court pushing for it, and like you said, I think at the larger level, the military leadership and the government leadership have more or less accepted it कि हाँ okay करना है, कैसे ना gradually करेंगे. But before we get to that कैसे करेंगे, कैसे हो रहा है right now, the historical perspective, why was this resistance there in the first place?
So it's not a complicated answer, Dev. All militaries to begin with have been, I'm talking about modern militaries, have been almost overwhelmingly male dominated. There was hardly any women force in most militaries, for the longest time. Things started to change when a lot of the support arms, could be populated by women officers, women soldiers, etc. It's happened in different militaries across the world. It started happening a little late here in India. Women were confined to the medical corps, the nursing corps and things like that. But changing times, changing the way people see things, changing society has obviously meant that it was only a matter of time before the military needed to open up a little bit more. Now, the reason why there was so much resistance within militaries, and you're right, I'm saying army a lot, and I'll tell you why it's different for the Air Force and the Navy, is that for decades and centuries, I'll say decades because we're not even a century old yet. The army is, and for the sake of argument, let's just confine ourselves right now to the Indian Army. Has been overwhelmingly, peopled by men, has structures, has interpersonal relationships, has command structures, has the way of doing things, has a lexicon, has a language, has, a fraternity, literally a fraternity, that is almost entirely male-centric. From officers to soldiers to support, to everything in between is all completely male-centric. When the idea of bringing women into non-support areas, and I mean away from your the nursing corps and the medical corps where women have always been part of it, there was resistance for two reasons. A, because you've been used to an organization that has been completely male. You've never had to work alongside, report to, or give orders to women. So you're suddenly wondering, how is this going to be? It's going to change everything because it's a complete cultural overhaul. Because it's not like these people don't interact with women. They know who women are. They've got families. They've got friends. It's not an alien concept to them. But within the army, I think most of us in the civilian world don't understand that the army is predicated on a very precise set of levers and gears. And if any of those don't work, there's going to be a problem. It's a command structure which is reliant on clarity, predictability, the chain of command, absolute obedience to orders, and things like that. In an organization that's populated by 1.1 million human beings of different kinds. Now, you bring in the women factor in it, there are sociological issues. All of your your soldiery, your officers may be from cities and towns and elsewhere, but your soldiers are from the countryside, from the villages where things are significantly more patriarchal. I'm simplifying this a great deal to try and capture some of the immediate issues that were seen to be possible, problems for women coming into the army. Would soldiers from the countryside take orders from a woman officer? Those are not issues anymore, but I'm saying those are some of the thoughts that came in. What about a senior woman officer and a junior male officer? What kind of dynamic would that be? The relationship between a woman commanding officer or a woman officer and male soldiers who may be older in age. All these different dynamics that have their tentacles in the larger umbrella of the patriarchy, as we call it. It's just an escape word for us. Are very relevant and were very relevant in the army. The good news is that women in the armed forces, by the turn of the century, by 2000 in India, the government of the day, the society at large, was no longer seeing this as a kind of symbolic token kind of gesture. As aspirations rose, as women aspired to be in the armed forces, not out of having no other choice, but genuinely wanting to serve in uniform, became a totally normal thing. It was not possible to do it anymore. But that resistance meant, and like you rightly pointed out, that every step of what women have been able to achieve in terms of entry into the armed forces has been in the wake of some kind of Supreme Court order. And that's because I think left to themselves, it's quite sad, I agree with you. But the reason for that is, I think these institutions by themselves, if it is left to them, it would be a much, much slower process. Much. 1950 is when it began. 1950 is when the fight started. Imagine something like this starting in 1950, and in 2020 you've got permanent commission.
Yes.
Which means 70 years for permanent commission. Okay? There are many steps before that. There were lots of things they needed before they could even think of permanent commission. But 70 years, 3/4 of a century almost, is that paints you all the picture that you need about how difficult it has been to just reach that parity level. So that's where things are at.
Yeah, right. We'll talk more about why it's the army that we keep referring to on this episode, and why not as so much the Navy and the Air Force. But after a quick break.
I still remember the first time that I was told I am pre-diabetic. What am I doing wrong?
So the first thing to understand about why this is happening is to understand two factors. One is genetic. The other is the environment.
Are there some steps which you would say are essential for managing diabetes?
Lifestyle management is critical in management of diabetes, and it is important for people to know that diet and exercise do play a very important role in managing their glucose levels. It's small, simple steps. It's healthy, following a healthy meal plan and regular physical activity. Diabetes specific nutrition supplement in the form of oral supplement in consultation with a doctor for right nutrition could be one way of management of diabetes. Now, these are designed for diabetes, people with diabetes.
Take a few steps back and then lay what Puri said a little more in context now. Some things have changed in our understanding of the management of diabetes. First thing is, I don't want to get into the big remission question, but we know that the key to managing diabetes is to help the patient lose weight first. and there the diet, and we know that this can be achieved without medications. This can, and it can be achieved without surgery.
Welcome back. Shiv and I are discussing a topic that on which I think we run a very, very high risk of being trolled massively online because I can picture almost immediately people calling this a manel of two men talking about women and whether or not they belong into the Indian military. On that, I don't want to clarify, but I just wanted to address it because I know that's going to happen, and it's and I think it's fair that we do address it. This is not a debate on the question of whether women should be in the armed forces. This is a discussion on a recently viral letter by a top army officer where he's raised some what he thinks are issues with having, not with having, but issues that he seems to have spotted with among around 7 to 8 women commanding officers under him. And like we do on every week, you are somebody who's been covering the world of defense, Indian military, Indian Army, Navy, Air Force for so many years. We are discussing this with the benefit of your reporting experience and the benefit that you of that you bring in terms of the context. So it's not a debate, which is why I think it's completely fine for us to just sit and chat about it. So taking the chat forward, the Indian Air Force, I think, had women in a combat role by 2015, if I'm not wrong. 2015, 2013, when you had those first 3 flying officers, fighter pilots. The Navy has followed more or less the same timeline. The Army up until 2023 did not really have women in combat roles. Even now, the combat role is limited to artillery, which is where they get posted. Infantry still a no, but I'm pretty sure going forward, some maybe a few years, a decade down the line, that also open up. What you mentioned just before the break. Do you think one of the reasons, this could end up being a tangent, but I think it's important we discuss it. Do you think one of the reasons it is the Army that is even slower compared to Air Force or the Navy to respond on this topic is the regiment system? Because the regiment system is the one that was left to us by the Britishers, is the one where you have all these societal flaws being exploited to build the army, if you're kind of getting my point. So like you said, the stark reality of having soldiers from the countryside, from the villages where patriarchy does exist, even though we would like it not to, but it does. And then trying to have this system where you're kind of trying to do away with the patriarchy, but the soldiers are still from there and are still from that culture. So the army, a large part of it is kind of built from that ground. So do you think that is the reason, or is there something else altogether?
Look, first of all, the army is very different from the Air Force and the Navy. Apart from its size, it is also situated very differently. It's on the front lines. Yes. It is in forward areas, at the border, etc. Not that the Navy and Air Force are not on the front lines doing genuine defense work. They most definitely are, lest somebody should mistake what I'm saying. But by the sheer scale of the Indian Army, its sheer spread, the sheer complexity of its command structure and the regiment system, it cannot be compared with the Army, the Navy and the Air Force in terms of women in uniform. Far simpler a task to bring women into the Air Force and the Navy, if you ask me, because for the reasons I've just mentioned. Now, the Air Force and the Navy, it's not been easy for them. I'm not saying that it's been a walk in the park for them to bring women in. I come from a generation of journalists who've been on board Navy warships where there were no women's toilets. I've been on board with women journalists and there were no separate women's toilets. Wow. And special arrangements had to be made. So it has taken a sea change in, no pun intended, a real sea change for the Navy to do that. Now they build warships with special quarters. There are women who serve on board warships. There are commanding officers who are women of offshore patrol vessels. And it's only a matter of time before we see women commanding officers of frontline ships as well. The same sort of patriarchy / sociological issues that I talked about with the Army, they apply with the Air Force and the Navy as well, but to a smaller extent because these are smaller forces smaller units and things like that. With the army, the regiment system that you just mentioned is most certainly one factor. The size of the army and the level of immediate defense responsibility is another factor. I remember reading a column some years ago when the Air Force and the Navy had started making those changes that you mentioned, bringing in women onto warships, women fighter pilots. They had said that the Air Force and the Navy, they have a little more breathing space, a little bit more elbow room to bring women in and experiment with, creating a level playing field and opening those doors. For the army, which is constantly in a kind of, frontline defense mode, it's a little bit more difficult, which is why they've had to do it with support arms, which is this is where women can operate in right now with the army. The engineers, the signals, the Army Air Defense, Intelligence Corps, Army Service Corps, Army Ordnance Corps, and electrical and mechanical engineers. So even now you don't have women in your armored corps. You can't have them in your mechanized infantry, and these are no-go zones, as Rahul writes in his article for the army. General Bipin Rawat, when he was alive, had famously said, there will be a time when women will be in the infantry. There will be a time when women will be in the armored corps. There will be a time when they will be in the mechanized infantry, whatever it is. He said, and I remember his words. He said, that train has left the station. And he meant it not in a symbolic way. General Bipin Rawat was one of those rare generals who, he was CDS, which means he had seen everything there was to see in the army, which means he's a person who had gone from being a young lieutenant, commanding at all levels and rising to be the army chief and then chief of defense staff, which means he has a 360-degree perspective on all of these issues that I've talked about. He knows that there are sociological problems. He knows that the army is not a gender laboratory. He knows that the army is not a canvas for woke projects.
Yes.
He knows that you can't impose DEI in the army. He knows that the army is not a place to prove some point to someone, open the doors for women. He knows that there is a very entrenched section within the army that says, boss, don't bring women in. It's a very bad idea. Do not bring women in. You will pay for it later. You're trying to prove a point right now saying, we are equal, gender equality and all that. But when shit hits the fan in war, you won't be able to do anything. So watch out, step carefully. He knows about sections within the army that say, make all tests and entry requirements and criteria absolutely equal between men and women, and doodh ka doodh and pani ka pani saaf ho jayega and stuff like that. So this is a man who had a complete 360-degree experience and view of where the army stands. And still he said, this train has left the station. I am going to put women in the persons below officer rank. I am going to make women military police. I am going to put women into artillery. I am going to get women into this. He had a structure. It's very sad that he's no more, but he had a vision and a structure for how he's going to bring women into things. And the thing is, even though he was a man who was in a hurry and wanted to bring change quickly, and he loved the drama of a tough decision and doing it quickly and in front of the media and things like that, but he was someone who realized that this cannot be done with a hammer fist. It has to be done one step at a time. Because even though there is a section that says, but sir, agar aap itne mahila commanding officers ko itne jaldi se laoge, to then it will cause problems for command structure. My men will not listen to them. They will not participate in the war game. There will be disciplinary issues. All these interpersonal crises will break. Then what will you do? You'll have an even bigger problem on your hand. General Rawat, and there are other generals like him, recognize that you have to take everyone along for something like this. You cannot ignore the people who are saying there will be problems. You cannot ignore the people who says, forget all the problems. Time has come for women to come to the armed forces. Every single one of these people has a voice because they're part of the army. It's fancy to on the one hand, it's fancy to say, all this is bullshit. Okay, this is all just a fancy way of saying you want to keep women out. Okay, women have to be given a level playing field to join the army. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is saying that, look, don't bring your woke bullshit here. This is the Indian army. This is a place where people have to defend territory with their blood and their bodies. So please don't use the army as a gender experimentation lab. You can do that in your companies, you can do that in your schools, you can do that in your colleges, you can do that in your NASA and everywhere else. Please don't do it in combat units, for God's sake, because here humans actually mean something. Okay? And to prove some kind of point about gender equality, etc., if I end up in my unit with people who are not suboptimal, I have 45% women in my unit, but they're not suboptimal compared to men, then I'm going to have a real problem in war. Now, there are these two very, very polarizing views that currently still exist in the army. If you speak to people in the army right now, they wouldn't want to, create a controversy by having an unpopular opinion and saying, nay, women are a problem. But I know sensible, modern, progressive, measured, educated, forward-looking army officers, men, with daughters, with wives, whatever it is, who say, yaar, it's not that simple. Yaar, it's not that simple. Tum log, you guys think ki it's a equality issue. We have to open the doors and do it, but it's not that simple. It's not that simple is like a buzzword on this issue in the army. It captures everything about how officers feel about this issue. But even given all these amazing dramatic contradictions, General Bipin Rawat said, whatever it is, the train has left the station. Matlab, ki their views will also be taken, their views will also be taken, women's views will also be taken, soldiers' views will also be taken, but the train will not stop now. Everyone is going to have to get on that train. You want to get on it, you get on it now. You want to get on it now when it's rumbling slowly, good for you. Because it's going to move fast later, and then you're screwed, and then you'll be left out. And when it's moving fast, it means that women are going to be part of every part of the army. They're going to be in the infantry, they're going to be in the thing. And the thing is, he said, I am not saying this as a romantic gesture. I have nothing to prove. These changes will come long after I'm dead. He said, I will not be alive. Ironic that he said it. He said, I will not be alive to see these changes. But they will happen because it's something whose time has come बहुत साल पहले.
Yes.
But somewhere someone needs to draw the line and say, this needs to be implemented. So that's the kind of journey that he sparked. And this government believes it. They don't want to stop on it at all. I don't think the next big step in terms of women in combat is going to come from the Supreme Court. It'll come from the Ministry of Defense.
Yeah. Right. So which brings me back to, which brings me to the last point and also back to that viral letter.
Yeah.
Because then the question arises, so bhi ho kya raha hai fir? Let's leave that social media debate away of, kyun leak hua, kaise leak hua, what was his intention, kyun likha, kaise likha. Let's leave that aside. Let's leave aside, is this guy patriarchal? Does he hate women? Or, questions on his basically character. There's no point going there. Like I said, this was supposed to be a letter. This is his feedback. He could be entirely wrong for all we know. His boss could be like, bhai, what is this? I don't believe it, what you said. And be like, okay, nahi, jo bhi ho. What is happening on the ground? You said that General Rawat said the train has left the station.
Yeah.
This is going to happen. How do you make it happen? I'm pretty sure there will be more steps that will be taken. There will be steps that we haven't imagined yet. But you would obviously know of steps that have already been taken. So what is happening on the ground in terms of the integration when it comes to women into the Indian Army? Fully, not just commanding officer has happened because of Supreme Court. You will, I think, maybe if my count is right, 3 + 2 + whatever. So maybe around 5 to 6 years down the line, you will have women officers who have been trained from the NDA. Just like you have almost any army chief who's been, NDA, then IM, and then they enter. So you'll have that as well. So when it comes to integrating women into the Indian Army fully, and when I say fully, I mean to the level of, let's say, the infantry unit that's, let's say, facing off against China at the LSE. What is happening right now, the letter that we spoke about at the top of this episode, the problems it highlights, how many of them are genuinely valid, or what will the system and what will the army and the leadership do to address them, and what can we look at coming in the next few months?
Even as we kind of snark at this letter and say we wish it hadn't come out, and a certain amount of responsibility needs to be taken by the army structure itself to ensure that women commanding officers are well trained, etc. This is a very serious letter.
Yes.
Let's not be dubious about that at all. It's a serious letter that has raised very serious issues. That now that the letter has been fired, it will have to be addressed at some level. I know a lot of women officers in the army. I know a few commanding officers as well, and their view is like what you mentioned initially, is that this is a small sample. I think this might be restricted to some particular issues with some particular commanding officers, and it's been blown out of proportion. At least 3 people I spoke to said it's been blown out of proportion, and there may be a measure of that as well. I don't think this is about all women in the military or the armed forces, but the gravity of what has been said has made it quite alarming. So people are taking it very seriously. Now, that's point number 1. Point number 2, Dave. It's very easy for us to sit here and say, to quote, easy for me especially to quote General Bipin Rawat and say that the train has left the station and that the next stop will be infantry and uske baad will be tanks and then there will be special forces and all those things. It may not even happen in our lifetime. I really hope it does, but it may not even happen in our lifetime. But there are processes for everything. And when I said that the next big change will not happen via the Supreme Court, but will happen from the MOD, I strongly believe it, because even fighter pilots, women fighter pilots, was a decision taken by the government.
Yes.
And always remember that changes of this kind have to follow a certain number of technical procedures. Efficacy needs to be tested. Is this something that will backfire? Will this affect operational readiness? Can women fit into these roles? Without any special changes. Let me give you an example of fighter pilots. Do you think that the government simply said, "Bahut ho gaya, I am going to open fighter pilot stream for women"? Do you know how many things happened before that? There was an aeromedical study of the female body.
Wow.
There was an aeromedical study conducted by a woman air marshal from the Air Force Medical Corps, who conducted a 3-year study with women. She herself flew in a fighter plane and conducted a study about the female body and how, as far as fighter aircraft are concerned, G-forces, all those things were conducted. Then there were practical administrative issues related to aeromedical concerns. What about a woman's menstruation? What about pregnancy? What if they get pregnant and then they can't do it? Women will get married and they'll leave. All these super patriarchal things came into effect, but they had to be dealt with at the Air Force level because those things there need to be clarity on those things. Can you tell like for example, questions would come up during this study saying, if we allow women to be fighter pilots, can we tell them no marriage for 5 years? No getting pregnant for the next 6 years.
Wow.
As a country, as a democracy, as a free country, can we order someone not to get pregnant? Can it be a barter system that's saying, we'll make you a fighter pilot, but no getting pregnant for 6 years? Can we do that? There are all these real world complexities that come into the frame. Finally, a system has been evolved where the government said, open the damn cockpit. Let them come, and we are not going to put any strictures on these things. These are people who are fully capable, like men, to take responsible decisions by themselves. Nobody is going to run into a cockpit and immediately get pregnant or run away or do something else. If they've trained to be a fighter pilot, every bit like men, then they have the responsibility to know that they're going to be in it for the long haul, be in it for a while or at least for a few years without any other distractions immediately. So all those things then evaporated. So then there was clarity. Then people saw the light saying, let's do it. Now you've got I don't know. I think you've got 26 women fighter pilots right now. Some of them may be on their way to becoming commanding officers of their units. It's awesome. Fabulous. India will have at some point the most number of women fighter pilots in the world. So that's a story that has ended really, really happily. It's more complicated in the army. It is more complicated in the army. And but I don't see a reason for it not happening. Like in the army, there will have to be studies. There will have to be small, a certain limited kind of rollout maybe in some units with the like is happening in the CRPF right now. Maybe women battalions. But that's not the idea. The idea is to integrate women into the army, not have special Mahila battalions. And believe me, even that was an idea at some point of time. But it was immediately, thank God, it was completely abandoned, because the idea is like, this is not about having special women units. It's about letting women be part of the army, at every level, wherever, if they are eligible, if they are fit enough, if they meet all the criteria, then best man or woman for the job. Let them go against each other, and whoever's the best, let that be it. So every other step that's going to happen, it's going to take a while, but there will be a procedure.
Yeah. In a way, don't you agree then it's kind of good with the benefit of hindsight that letter did end up finding its way to the press, because otherwise this issue was kind of done and dusted, right? Sab mil gaya, matlab, हाँ, permanent commission mil gaya, NDA में entry mil gaya, okay, women are there in the army. No one's thought about issues like you've just described right now. Even then there are issues, and I think that little backstory of what happened before women were allowed into the fighter stream, that actually is quite fantastic. I don't think it's been widely reported, honestly, Shiv, because I've never read about it, and I was quite fascinated. So that's great. Thank you for that. So just one last quick point, and I think it's kind of to extend on what you just said. At the end of the day, then, even now, after this so-called, we've reached this progressive attitude of yes, okay, we need to have women in the forces. Do you still think? I think you do. That ultimately, the civilian push is what's gonna happen, because, and this is the question actually, there is still a risk that. If you were to leave it to the military even now, even after what the Supreme Court has done, even after what the government has kind of ordered, they might end up delaying it because of what you just described much earlier, the different factions and so much, controversy and so many different clashing thoughts and opinions within the military.
The thing is, it's never an optimal thing when something is forced on the military.
Yes.
It's never optimal, okay? There's a great deal of resentment. There's a great deal of, court gaye aur mil gaya ye, verdict. Many such decisions have resulted in, nudge, nudge, wink, wink kind of jokes, mess hall humor, prejudice, bias. When very few people understand that, women have better things to do than to spend their lives fighting in court for what they see as the as not a favor, not a handout, but basically a level playing field in the military. And these are women who are not asking for special privileges. They're saying, give us a level playing field, and if we don't make the cut, reject us. For God's sake. But I think that there's still a pretty long way to go in terms of that kind of integration. But the truth of the matter, Dave, is that imposing anything on the army is not optimal at all, or the armed forces is not optimal at all. But the army and the military, and I'm not lecturing the army or the military here, they've taken their time in realizing a truth, which is that women don't need a certificate from anyone. Women are not asking for a certificate. Women are not saying, see, I can prove this to you, then you can admit me in the army. They're not saying that at all. But the army needs to know that it is possible to create processes, structures, entry mechanisms, etc., in such a way that none of this is a gender experiment, none of this is a DEI experiment, none of this is a symbolic project, but about literally getting the best people for the military. Literally the best people for the military. Now we can get stuck on the point of, should we confine women only to support roles like radar controllers and intelligence and things like that, and leave infantry and artillery only for the men as a kind of as a kind of academic exercise, and postpone it down the road and say aage ke generations dekh lenge when they are ready. Or we can say that create those structures now, where it is no longer where the army becomes gender blind, saying that one test, one entry system, one set of criteria, one set of everything, and if a woman is better than a man, we will choose the woman. If a man is better than the woman, we will choose the man, and nobody can cry in that respect, and we will not differentiate between them. We will be realistic. We will acknowledge that there are certain differences between men and women. Any calibration as far as that is concerned will be applied. But in the spirit of things, we will make it a level playing field. In the letter that General Puri has written, coming to end with that, he says it's not about gender equality, it's about gender neutrality.
Yes.
Okay? And he makes a good point. And I think if you kind of subsidize all those other things that he's said, which we can say are between him and his commanding officers and the army, and let them sort that out. We are no one to lecture them on those things. The idea of gender neutrality, which he's asking for, is the highest ideal that the army can dream of.
Yes.
It means that the army no longer has a checkbox as far as gender or sex is concerned.
Yep.
It doesn't need that. Which means I need the best soldier for this role. Woman, man, doesn't make a difference. If the man is better than the woman as far as radar controller is concerned, please. Man is better than a woman as far as army teacher is concerned, please. Woman is better than the guy as far as the commando is concerned, no problems at all. This may seem hugely unrealistic, totally utopian, totally too idealistic for the real world. There are people who say, come on, man. I mean, this is the army you're talking about. Do you want to subject the army to these fantasies? It's going to happen. Train has left the station. It will happen. It's only a matter of time. That's it.
Yeah. Train has left the station. I think we'll end the episode on that note. Thanks, Shiv. I think a fantastic chat, actually, because I really wanted. I always had this topic in my notes, and on one day we wanted to discuss. Because I was always looking for a peg and like what to start with. And this letter and the controversy around it kind of gave us that moment. But I didn't want it to be about that itself. And this is actually, I think, what we've done on this episode, trying to explain the sheer complexities of this issue. And it's like you said, like you've made it amply clear on this episode. It is not as simple as like you said, tokenism ki haan karne ke liye kar diya fir dekha jayega. It's not about that. There are real issues involved. They will be resolved. How? We'll see and we'll find out.
Correct.
So thanks, Shiv. Great chat. Thanks as always to our listeners and viewers. Thanks for all the comments you keep giving us, and please do keep commenting and keep giving us ideas that you want us to talk about. And thanks as always to our producer Anna Priyadarshini. That's it for this week's Defense Dose. For more, tune in next week. Till then, stay safe and not cross any boundaries with a passport. Bye-bye.